Welcome to Good Grief, the podcast where resilience meets reality. I'm your host, Dr. Christine Malone. In this podcast, we delve deep into the stories of individuals who've triumphed over tragedy, adversity, and trauma. In every episode, we bring you raw and honest narratives from guests who faced life's most challenging moments head on. Through candid conversations, they share their journeys of resilience, shedding light on the strategies, mindset shifts, and support systems that empowered them to rise above their darkest hours. Join us as we explore the profound depths of human resilience and discover how, even in the face of life's toughest trials, there can be light, growth, and yes, good grief. Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining me for my episode today. I have an amazing guest that we're going to talk with. This is Lieutenant Colonel Tom Williams, U.S. Marine Corps retired. And he's going to talk to us about his book series and his experiences in Vietnam War and so on, Marines in combat and so on. So, Tom, if you would like to tell us just a bit about yourself and about your books.
Well, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tom Williams, U.S. Marine Corps retired. I served, my first book is Doorsteps of Hell. In that book, I tell the story about being abandoned at the ripe old age of 6 months. My mother handed me from pillar to post within the family. My mother remarried. She remarried a Air Force officer who was a founding father of Air Force JAG, Judge Advocates General Corps. And my life really began at 6. For all intents and purposes, I moved to Morocco with my new father, and I learned to speak French. I learned to speak Arabic because those were my playmates. I learned the joy of raising vegetables, flowers, and fruit trees. We then moved all over the world. My dad's last posting was in Japan. I learned a little Japanese there, but then I fell in love with the Japanese culture. We moved back to the family farm. The farm was established in 1832. Before it was a state of Georgia. Our pioneer family members rolled up there in covered wagons, got lost, cut the timber, and built a farm that still exists and which is run by my brother, my youngest brother. I then went off to North Georgia College, where I really found myself, and I found true like-minded mates in my classmates. In the 60s, we all knew we were going to Vietnam, so we became very serious about learning the trade of warfighting. We all went off to Vietnam. Most of my friends went to the Army. Only about 6 of us went in the Marine Corps. I set the record for the obstacle course of 52 seconds for 100 yards and 14 obstacles. Went on to Vietnam to be a second lieutenant infantry platoon commander, followed by being a recon platoon commander. And then 2 years later, after that tour, I went back to Vietnam. And this became an aerial observer embedded with the Vietnamese because I had also attended Vietnamese language school before I went on my first tour. And since they spoke French and Vietnamese and broken English, I was able to very easily coordinate with them, flying the aircraft, finding, fixing, and killing the communists. And then after I retired, I went to the Middle East. I trained the Saudi Arabian National Guard, and then I went to Afghanistan for 5 years, and I trained the 207th Corps on the Iranian border. I think that's probably enough to get us started.
You have a life of lots of stuff going on, that's for sure. And I do want to thank you for your service. As I mentioned before we started recording, I lost an uncle just this last year who served in Vietnam. I still have another uncle who's still living that also served in Vietnam. So it's a topic that I'm quite passionate about. So tell us a bit about kind of like maybe your years actually in active combat duty in theater where, people are losing comrades, if you will, people that you might be friends, whatever, in there. Kind of how was that like, and how did you work through that at that early time in your life?
Well, casualties were almost a daily affair. You've heard of booby traps, I'm sure. They call them IEDs now.
Yep, yep.
But booby traps could range from anything from a 250-pound bomb down to a hand grenade. The most common were hand grenades. Hand grenades that they would pull the pin, they would take one of our discarded sea ration cans, slip the grenade in to hold the spoon in place, and then put a tripwire so that the unsuspecting Marine or soldier would trip the wire, the grenade would come out of the can and then explode and would either kill or badly injure the Marine or soldier. That that was my very first casualty on about my third day. I had a young Marine who tripped a booby trap. It blew off a portion of his hand. The other three Marines in close proximity were wounded, but not severely wounded. And those booby traps were so common that it was merely you were a footstep away from either being injured or disintegrated, depending on the size of the booby trap. I think that what I would say about the grief, in most cases, it was the cost of doing business, and I know that sounds callous. Maybe you know some people might not understand. You have to compartmentalize that grief because you're in the middle of combat. Yeah, you take care of your wounded, you evacuate him, but you have to continue to operate. You cannot dwell on it.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Otherwise, how on earth would you survive if you were having this happen on a regular basis like that? So I can totally understand that. So one thing I do want to get into, you have some of these things that you've listed here on the paperwork I have about you. It's about combat strategies to avoid loss in life and further grief. So let's talk about a few of those if you don't mind. The first one you've got here is night movement in the rain. What is that all about?
Well, we U.S. servicemen were in Vietnam. The Army was there for 12 months, and we Marines were there for 13. And it was common for it to rain sometimes almost constantly during the wet monsoon season. One thing that I learned very early in my first tour was that the enemy would hunker down and during the rain, and we, of course, wanted to hunker down. But I mean, when I say hunker down, I'm talking go into a bivouac, tactically dig a fighting hole, and remain overnight. However, I also knew that the enemy was constantly keeping us under observation. A short story that's in my book, we were setting into a night defensive position, and I had the eerie feeling that the enemy was there. There were no birds, there was no sound other than the sound of Marines digging and preparing for their defensive position. So I took a fire team of 4, myself and a fire team, and I started scouting behind my position and on the flanks of my position, and I came across a footprint, a barefoot human footprint and water was running into the toe of that bare footprint. Now that tells you you're close behind. He's not far ahead of you. So I tactically moved my men around, and I then found a lean-to, and under the lean-to was a smoldering fire, and on a stone was a canteen of hot tea. He was watching us. He was keeping tabs on us. So based on that, and other instances, often at night, I would move my Marines surreptitiously, very quietly, out of that position and into a new position so that the enemy would not know where I was at daylight. They would come looking for us, and many times when they would come looking for us, they would walk into my ambush. Does that answer your question?
It does, actually. I was thinking to myself, it sounds very tactical, like you're trying to outmaneuver the other side.
Well, I write about those that story is exactly what I write about in my first book, because war has not changed over millennia for the young fighting man. New technical weapons, and I was involved in replacing or improving the tools of our trade and Headquarters Marine Corps many, many years after I had combat experience. So I knew that was one reason I was given the assignment, because I was one of few at that time at headquarters that had that kind of infantry reconnaissance and aerial observer combat experience. So they made me the acquisition sponsor project officer for improving or replacing every infantry weapon from 1980 to 83. That was 83 to 86. That was my job.
Gotcha. That sounds fascinating. One thing I know, as someone in your shoes, you've lived through and witnessed some pretty harsh realities of war. What would you say are some of the most important lessons that you've learned about leadership, survival, and grief for things like that in the military?
Well, first of all, I would say that we have a secret weapon in the Marine Corps, as we do also in the United States Army. And that secret weapon is the Marine and the soldier. We have some remarkable, absolutely remarkable young men that choose to serve their nation by being in the service. That's first. That's the first most important thing. And the thing that you have to remember about, or you have to think about regarding that young fighting man, that young warrior, that young gladiator, is that you've got to take care of him. He has needs. He needs leadership. You can't let him talk at night. You can't let him smoke at night. You can't let him, excuse the use of this term, but it's something that described. And that is, soldiers and Marines loved to group up, and we referred to it as clusterfuck. You can't let them just get together and shoot the bull. They have to remain as much as possible 15 meters apart, because you can't afford to have more than one man wounded as a result of a booby trap. The first story I told you, I lost 3 Marines.
Wow.
From one booby trap. The next thing is their health. And I cannot say enough about the duty of care played by the medic in the Army and the corpsman in the Marine Corps. While they're not angels, they certainly are on the battlefield.
Oh, yeah. And then playing a very important role.
And, you know, part of that care is insects because you're living in the elements. You don't bathe. There's no such thing as a shower. Your feet will rot off
Yeah.
from immersion foot in that wet environment. So you had to every day look at your marine's feet. You issued insect repellent. There was a antiseptic ointment, and I call it, to this day, I keep 6 or 8 tubes in a travel kit, in a medicine cabinet, in a drawer. I'm never without it. Bacitracin antiseptic ointment. It will disinfect scratches and cuts like nothing you've ever seen. I keep it handy even today after more than 50 years of having been introduced to it in Vietnam.
Yeah. Well, it obviously works, right?
Yes, it's good stuff.
Good stuff. When you find something that's good stuff, you want to keep hanging on to it in case you need it again. So
Yeah.
I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about grief and healing as a veteran. So obviously veterans who've served in active duty where there's been, fighting going on, they've obviously lost people and so on. So what would you kind of, for a listener who maybe is either active duty or has someone in their family active duty that's struggling with grief, or I'll call it survivor's guilt because they made it out and maybe their fellow soldier did not. What kind of advice would you offer based on your own experiences? What's worked for you?
Okay, I didn't hear the first part of that question. Excuse me, my hearing is not
Right,
very
all
good.
right. I'm asking about what advice or strategies would you give to someone who is either currently grieving because they've lost soldiers, or maybe a family member who's lost someone in the military. What's worked for you for grieving and healing over the years?
Well, I think that the best cure is to speak to people that were with that family member at the time of his death on the battlefield. I have young Marines who have stayed in touch with one another and with families of those that they have lost. I'll give you an example. My last tour in Vietnam, I flew 190 missions as an air observer, and I turned over my AO section to a young lieutenant, Dwight Rickman, on the 25th of December, 1972. He was shot down and killed after flying only about a dozen missions. My commander at the time was Ed Jones, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Jones. He stayed in touch with that family, and he continues to stay in touch with that family because that was his way of helping the family deal with the grief.
Hmm.
When when I learned about it, I had I'd been given 10 days basket leave by Colonel Jones. I went to Bangkok, but the condition was that I would call back every day or two to to Saigon and let them know I was alive and well, and I would be back for my flight back to Hawaii, which is where I was permanently assigned at the time. I went back to Vietnam for temporary additional duty for 180 days. It was only intended for 90, but I like to tell people I was so good they wouldn't let me go back. you know? Well, I finally got in touch with the family myself, and they were very appreciative about me contacting them because I wanted to go back from Bangkok to where I had flown. I have an eye, and that I have the eye of seeing things on the ground that others don't. And that was why I was so good at my job as an air spotter, because I could find them, fix them, and kill them. And I wanted to find where Dwight might have crashed. He was shot down, never recovered. But members of a unit should always engage family members of the lost Marine or soldier. It helps the family overcome the grief.
And I would imagine, Tom, it also helps the soldier who's able to share that. I mean, if you're there when someone is killed, I would imagine that's incredibly traumatic. And so to be able to help the family, I think would help the soldier too. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. I would say that's very much so.
Yeah.
But there are some tragic conditions, such as when I reported to Anwa to the 5th Marine Regiment, there were no job openings. The next morning, there were 2. Both had lost their legs. Both, one died and one lived. The one that died, I got his job. All right. The young Marine that lives up on the Canadian border that I spoke to you about before we started the podcast, he told me a story about the day or 2 before when they hit another booby trap. And the booby trap was so huge that it dismembered the Marine officer. And my squad leader was knocked down by a detached leg, and other body parts were up in the trees, unrecoverable. Only a leg was really recoverable to send back to the family. Horrific injuries like that are difficult for the observer to handle as much as it is for the family
Yeah.
to realize.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I can't even fathom such a thing. I do also want to ask you about, I know that you, with your Heart of a Marine book series, you've actually put them together into a special pocket resource for service people. So kind of fit in their coat pocket or hip pocket. So
Yeah.
how how is that how is that helpful to someone currently serving in the armed forces?
What you will find in my pocket lessons learned, right now I have 2 volumes from book 1. What I've done is gone through my first book, Doorsteps of Hell. I've extracted lessons learned and I've attributed them to the page in the book that you can find the story. Some are like John F. Kennedy or Winston Churchill also have been included in that, because those are wise men and they had wise things to pass on. Now, why am I doing that? Many times, the answer to that is that many times when a unit is in the field, there's dead time, okay? Dead time in the evening, at lunchtime, or whatever, when you're taking a break. Is training to speak from an extemporaneous perspective on a lesson learned by me or others that I've included to a group of Marines in the field. You don't want your Marines to be idle. You got to give them something to do. Meaningful quotes from real experiences, combat experiences, are very important. There's 2 quotes that I love to use. Experience is the teacher of all things, Julius Caesar. And another one, which goes hand in glove with contact with the enemy. Our business is contact oriented. It's like football. If you don't want to be hit, you shouldn't be on the field. Your job is to close with and kill or capture the enemy. Boil it all down. That's what it's all about. But always remember that it is as much your obligation to protect your prisoner once he is captured as it was your intent to kill him. It's very important for young Marines and soldiers to understand combat is not an excuse to murder people. A dead man can't talk. In my time on the battlefield, I ran down 2 prisoners. I could see they had no weapon. My last day as an infantry platoon commander, I ran him down and tackled him. He was in full enemy uniform. You can't gather intel from a dead man. I'll tell you another thing that is as upsetting sometimes, not nearly as much, but yes, upsetting, is when you have a prisoner run from you or an enemy run from you and you can't stop him and you end up having to blow his head off. What a tragedy. It's important to treat your prisoners humanely.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important message. I know one thing I want to also, we're going to, in the podcast notes for your podcast, we'll put links in so that listeners can find your book series and read more about that. I'm curious to know, I mean, I know you said you turned 80 this year, but you're still going strong. What's next for you? What do you plan to do next after this? You got to keep writing?
Oh yeah, I have about 13 books that I want to write. I love to travel. I'm healthy as a horse. I have been wounded, but none so serious I couldn't earn a Purple Heart. They were slivers.
Mm-hmm.
When I had people losing their lives, losing their hands, losing their feet, losing their lives, for me to get a Purple Heart for a sliver, in fact, the last time it happened, my driver, I got ambushed in Da Nang. I was in a vehicle. I took machine gun fire. It hit my driver, literally took his left leg off. He couldn't, the pain was terrible, but I told him, push the gas with your right foot or we're dead. Get us out of the impact area, the kill zone. I then had him push in the clutch. I put it in neutral. I threw him back in the back of the vehicle with my A gunner, my assistant, my security guard that I had with me returning fire. I took the vehicle. The second burst hit me, but it was just slivers off the frame in my butt. I didn't even know I'd been hit until some time later. But that young man literally lost his leg.
Yeah. Yeah. Tragedy. Absolute tragedy. That makes, yeah. Well, I look forward to reading more about your books and so on as you keep on going. You obviously are still going strong. And I think the memories and so on that you have to share are really important lessons for a lot of people.
Well, I'm looking forward to doing more writing. I'm particularly enjoying writing book 3, which book 3, as I told you, is going to be somewhat of a travel log.
Mm-hmm.
And going into ancient history and I'm not trying to rewrite ancient history. I am only writing vignettes about interesting places that I visited that are not commonly known.
Right.
Paestum. Have you ever heard of Paestum?
I have not.
Well, it's one of the most interesting Greek cities in Italy. And if you're interested, I'll send you the vignette that I've written. I'm still writing on it, but it's only going to be 2 or 3 pages. I just need to boil down. It was a Greek city in about 550 BC, south of Salerno. I used to enjoy going to Pompeii, Herculaneum, and then driving the via Amalfi, go around Salerno, and then go spend the day in this Greek ruin. It was founded in 550, and abandoned after the Romans took it over and was lost for hundreds of years before it was rediscovered. But those kind of hidden treasures are what will be in book 3.
Awesome. I can't wait to read it. Well, Tom, thank you so much for your time today. I have really appreciated hearing about your experiences and your books, and you've been an absolute pleasure to chat with.
Well, my pleasure. I'll send you that vignette, and thank you for listening, and please pass the word. Give me your order for a book.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll put that in the podcast notes for sure, Tom. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Good Grief. We hope that the stories shared today have inspired and empowered you on your own journey of resilience. If you want to dive deeper into the themes of trauma, tragedy, and survival, be sure to check out my memoir, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival. In this book, I shared my own raw and honest experiences, offering insights and strategies for overcoming life's toughest challenges. You can purchase the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or listen to it on Audible. Your support helps us continue to bring these powerful stories to light and spread a message of hope and resilience. Stay tuned for more incredible stories on our next episode. Until then, remember, even in the face of life's toughest trials, there can be light, growth, and good grief.